40 years ago, the global economy was forever changed. When people remember then-President Richard Nixon, most think of the Watergate scandal and the subsequent collapse of his political career. That may be the case now, but history may remember him quite differently 50 years from now. Our bet is that he will one day be remembered best as the man who took the world off the gold standard and started the greatest pyramid scheme in recorded history. The year was 1971. The Vietnam War was sapping American resources. Inflation was at a 20-year high, and Nixon was facing a tough bid for re-election. Nixon was elected on a platform based mostly on his foreign policy agenda. Though he himself was known to have little interest in the domestic agenda, he did realize that voters tend to consult their checkbooks before showing up at the polls. With inflation at over 4.7%, Nixon knew action was needed to gain control of prices for the sake of near-term economic growth and his own re-election. In early August, the president met with his team of economic advisors at Camp David. On August 15, 1971, he announced temporary wage and price controls and ended convertibility of the U.S. dollar into gold. Inflation subsided for a time. Nixon won re-election, and the world's economy would never be the same. To understand the consequences of Nixon's decision, we have to look back, way back. The gold standard, as we understand it today, was the dominant fiscal force for the vast majority of recorded history. Starting long before the birth of Christ, the idea of valuing goods and services based on an amount of gold was the cornerstone of commerce for more than 98% of the last 2,000 years. Unlike modern fiscal standards and policies, the gold standard was not created. It arose naturally out of mutual free market agreement. Since gold was in limited supply and high demand, it was seen as a universal medium for value that could not be manipulated by one party in a transaction. For example, the year is 150 AD, and I want to enter into an agreement in which I take 1 cow per month from your farm each month for the next year in exchange for my work. The problem is, I don't work on your farm. I'm actually a blacksmith at some other guy's farm, and thus I can't trade my work for your cows. What we need is a convertible medium for value. In other words, we need money. The catch, however, is that we need the money to have worth in and of itself. I have to pay you something that has real value. If I simply give you a note that says I owe you for a cow, that note is only as good as my word. If I disappear the next day, you're holding the bag. Since we both agree that gold has value, and that its value is not something you or I can manipulate, it becomes the perfect medium for exchange. It becomes our money. We enter into a contract through which I pay you 1 ounce of gold per cow through the end of the year, and voila, a gold standard is born. That is free market economics at work. As the world's economy grew over time, the gold standard evolved with it. In the late 1800s, most nations operated on what's known as the classic gold standard. Under this system, nations fixed the value of gold to a specific amount of their local currency. In 1834, gold was pegged at $20.67 per ounce in the U.S., and there it stayed until 1933. In this system, international prices rose and sank together, regardless of the strength or weakness of each nation's economy. This is a crucial flaw in the gold standard from the standpoint of short-sighted governments, and a great benefit from the standpoint of long-term stability. We'll come back to that later. Though the consequences of the classic gold standard were complex, it basically worked on the premise that currencies shouldn't really change in value relative to each other. Instead, it held that weaker economies should accumulate less wealth and stronger ones more. Today, currencies change in value relative to each other based on the strength of each nation's economy. This makes wealth relative, which under the gold standard it is not. The significance of this important difference will become more obvious as we continue on. During the classic gold standard period, the balance between imports and exports from country to country was maintained through what's called the price-specie flow mechanism. That's economists speak for when our economy is booming, gold flows to us. When it's weak, gold flows away. Here's an example. Imagine we create some great new American product that everyone in the world wants to buy. Our economy is booming, and there are more goods and services being produced and made available to consumers. Since the value of the dollar is fixed to gold, we can't create more dollars without having more gold. As supply of goods increases and the number of dollars to buy them is unchanged, the price of those goods goes down. It's simple supply and demand. As prices here at home come down, people overseas want to buy our cheap goods. Thus, our exports increase. As our exports to other nations increase, they send us money, which under the classic standard is the same as gold. Thus, America sees an inflow of gold. As the amount of gold we hold increases, so does our money supply, and prices begin to increase as a result. Likewise, when our economy slows and prices at home increase, we buy more from overseas, and our imports increase relative to our exports. In sum, it looks like this. Economic growth leads to more availability of goods, which leads to prices falling. Falling prices leads to exports increasing, which leads to gold flowing in. Gold flowing in leads to higher money supply, which leads to prices rising, which equals equilibrium. Or economic recession leads to less availability of goods, which leads to prices rising. Rising prices leads to imports increasing, which leads to gold flowing out to other nations. Gold flowing out leads to lower money supply, which leads to prices falling. And that equals equilibrium. In the end, what the gold standard did was create long-term price stability. Local economic growth created falling prices, which were then brought back up again by an inflow of gold. The problem, of course, is that governments don't have the ability to control how quickly and how smoothly the process works. The gold standard, for all its simplicity and stability, does not necessarily fit the time frame of electoral cycles and short-term political goals. Before the shot heard round the world that started the Great War, the global economy saw a long period of growth and prosperity. That all changed quite quickly as World War I began to drain economic resources throughout the developed world. Nations faced with rising expenditures and a lack of tax revenue suspended their currency's convertibility to gold. Many saw extremely high inflation during war years and went back on the gold standard in 1925, attempting to curb rising prices. The problem for European governments was that the gold flow mechanism didn't work fast enough to reach price equilibrium before the onslaught of the Great Depression. As the global economy faltered in the early 1930s, governments around the world began to realize that they wanted to increase the money supply in order to drive down interest rates and spur economic growth. The idea was that if only money were cheaper to come by, it would encourage investment and growth through inexpensive borrowing. With the fixed money supply as a feature of the gold standard, central banks had little power to lower interest rates in attempts to create short-term growth. The UK was the first to leave the gold standard in 1931, and much of the world soon followed. There was one saving grace, however. The United States, the issuer of the US dollar, maintained its convertibility to gold. After the Second World War, nations around the world were again destitute, with inflation raging and little infrastructure to produce growth. One exception was the U.S., which, relatively speaking, was left enriched by the munitions trade during the first part of the war. As England dumped the majority of their gold into the pockets of U.S. arms producers, the massive imbalances created were too great for the gold standard to correct quickly enough. Thus, the Bretton Woods Agreement was born. Under the new agreement, a new international currency system was created in which foreign currencies were convertible into dollars, which were then convertible into gold. This enabled nations to create flexible fiscal policy and manipulate interest rates to spur growth, while the US dollar anchored the system with its gold convertibility. As time passed, the US dollar became the world's reserve currency. This happened partially because of the strength of the US economy and partially because of the dollar's convertibility to gold. Foreign governments began to buy and hold US dollars instead of gold as a main storage for wealth. At the time, it didn't matter because the dollar was, quite literally, as good as gold. The rest of the world prospered because central banks could artificially stimulate local economies and fan the fires of economic growth. The U.S. prospered because, as the issuer of the world's reserve currency, we could borrow money at almost no cost from the rest of the world. As everyone wanted to hold our dollars in treasury debt, it was as if the world had handed Uncle Sam a credit card with no borrowing limit and basically no interest rate. In the end, money, which used to be in limited supply, was now virtually free for the entire world. The linchpin that held it all together was the simple fact that everyone knew the US dollar could be traded in for a fixed amount of gold at any time. Then came the Vietnam War and our old friend, Dick Nixon. On August 15, 1971, Nixon announced that the mighty US dollar could no longer be converted into gold. One would think that the whole global economy would have collapsed overnight when people realized that their local currency was no longer backed by anything other than a government's word that it had value. It didn't, at least not overnight. There was global price instability and inflation through the rest of the decade, and gold appreciated more than 2,500% in less than 10 years. Even so, the global system didn't collapse, but it did slowly and unmistakably begin to change. Since none of the world's currencies have been backed by gold over the last 40 years, they have all depreciated in value significantly. The last 4 decades have, by all accounts, been the most intensely inflationary period in recorded history. Even the dollar, which has fared better than most, has lost over 80% of its value since 1971. The catch, however, is that governments have been able to artificially create economic growth such that it has, for the most part, kept up with inflationary pressures. In other words, when economies falter,